The conference room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of C-130s taxiing outside Bagram Airfield. Captain Marcus, Iron Rodriguez, slammed his tactical folder onto the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the cramped briefing room packed with officers from every branch. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his normally steady hands trembled slightly as he pointed at the satellite imagery projected on the wall. "Gentlemen, we've got a situation that's about to become a clusterfuck of epic proportions," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the weight of 17 years in the teams. The grainy black and white images showed a compound nestled in the Hindu Kush Mountains, surrounded by hostile terrain that made extraction nearly impossible. Alpha Team is pinned down in Grid Square 41, SMD 12,340, 67,890, taking heavy fire from an estimated 40 Taliban fighters. They've got wounded, including our HVT, and their extraction bird went down 20 minutes ago. The room erupted in murmurs as colonels and majors leaned forward, studying the tactical nightmare displayed before them. Rodriguez continued, his jaw clenched tight. "The weather's closing in fast. We're looking at zero visibility in 90 minutes. No fixed wing can get through those mountains in these conditions, and every rotary asset we have is either down for maintenance or already committed to other ops." An Air Force colonel cleared his throat. "What about close air support? We could vector in some A-10s once the weather clears." "By then, Alpha Team will be body bags," Rodriguez snapped, his patience wearing thin. The SEAL captain had lost men before, but never like this, never trapped like rats with no way out. He scanned the room, his dark eyes searching every face with growing desperation. Time was bleeding away with each passing second. Then Rodriguez did something that surprised everyone in that room, including himself. He took a deep breath, set his pride aside, and asked the question that would change everything. "Is there a combat pilot here right now who can fly in weather that would ground a guardian angel?" The silence that followed was deafening. 23 officers, the cream of America's military elite, sat motionless as the weight of the moment settled over them like a shroud. Outside, the wind began to howl through the compound, carrying with it the promise of the storm that would either save Alpha Team or seal their fate forever. In the back corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows cast by the overhead projector, someone stirred. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Rodriguez caught it. His eyes locked onto a figure he hadn't noticed before, someone who had been so quiet, so unremarkable that she had become invisible. Lieutenant Commander Zara "Ghost" Nakamura slowly stood up. The nickname Ghost wasn't earned through stealth operations or covert missions. It came from her uncanny ability to disappear into the background, to become so unremarkable that superior officers forgot she existed. Standing 5'4" in her flight suit, with prematurely gray streaks threading through her black hair, Nakamura looked more like a maintenance officer than one of the Navy's most decorated helicopter pilots. She had been sitting in the briefing room for 40 minutes, having arrived early as was her habit, watching the circus of male bravado unfold with quiet amusement. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a room full of warriors, she was the only one who had actually flown combat missions in weather that would make meteorologists weep. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can get your team out." Rodriguez's head snapped toward her, his expression shifting from confusion to skepticism in milliseconds. He took in her slight frame, the faded wings on her chest, and the absence of any flashy decorations that marked the Glory Hounds. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, sir. MH-60S pilot, 160th Soren." She paused, letting the significance of the Special Operations Aviation Regiment sink in. "I've got 4,000 hours in rotary wing, including 800 combat hours in Afghanistan and Iraq." A few officers exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes at what they perceived as another pilot overselling their abilities. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, his tactical mind weighing options against time. He had never heard of her, which in the small community of special operations was unusual. "Ghost," he said, testing the call sign on his tongue. "What makes you think you can fly in conditions that just grounded a crew with twice your experience?" Nakamura's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes, a memory of mountains and fire, of rotor wash and gunfire, of decisions made in seconds that saved or cost lives. "Because, sir, I wrote the manual on flying in 00 conditions. Literally. It's sitting in your training library right now, gathering dust." The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence had changed. Rodriguez felt a shift in the air, a subtle alteration in the dynamics that made his operator instincts sit up and take notice. 3 years earlier, Nakamura had been the lone survivor of a catastrophic mission in the mountains of Pakistan. Her crew chief, co-pilot, and 6 rangers had died when their bird was shot down during a rescue operation, remarkably similar to the current situation. She had crawled out of the wreckage with a shattered collarbone and second-degree burns, then spent 18 hours evading Taliban patrols before finally reaching an extraction point. The official report classified her actions as heroic. The unofficial whispers in the aviation community painted a different picture, some questioning her decisions, others wondering if she had done enough to save her crew. The doubts followed her like shadows, relegating her to training duties and routine transport missions. But Nakamura had used that time to study, to analyze, to become the pilot she wished she had been on that terrible night. Rodriguez made his decision with the cold calculation of a man who had spent his career balancing lives against impossible odds. "What do you need?" "An MH-60M, full fuel, and a crew chief who doesn't mind dying today," she replied without hesitation. "And sir, I'll need them to trust me completely, because where we're going, second-guessing will get us all killed." The SEAL captain nodded grimly. He had learned to read people in life-or-death situations, and something in Nakamura's steady gaze told him she wasn't making empty promises. "You'll have whatever you need. How long until you're airborne?" 20 minutes for pre-flight, sir. But I need the exact coordinates, current weather data, and tactical frequency for Alpha Team." As the briefing room exploded into activity, with officers shouting orders and radios crackling to life, Nakamura remained perfectly still, her mind already flying the mission. She visualized the approach, calculated fuel consumption, and planned for contingencies that would make lesser pilots wake up screaming. She had been waiting 3 years for a chance at redemption. Today, that chance had just walked through the door wearing the face of desperate men who needed miracles. The hangar bay was a symphony of organized chaos as Nakamura approached her aircraft. The MH-60M Black Hawk sat like a sleeping predator under the harsh fluorescent lights, its matte black paint absorbing light and reflecting nothing back. Ground crews swarmed over the helicopter, conducting final checks with the precision of pit crew members who understood that mechanical failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was fatal. Chief Warrant Officer Tommy Wrench. Mackenzie emerged from beneath the aircraft, hydraulic fluid staining his coveralls, and a concerned expression creasing his weathered face. At 42, Mackenzie had more hours maintaining special operations helicopters than most pilots had flying them. He had seen good pilots die from mechanical failures and mediocre pilots survive through sheer luck, but he had never seen Lieutenant Commander Nakamura fly anything more challenging than a routine transport mission. "Ma'am, I've got to be honest," Mackenzie said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "This bird's been down for maintenance for the past week. We just got her back online an hour ago, and I haven't had time to run her through a proper test flight." Nakamura nodded, running her hand along the helicopter's skin with the intimacy of a lover's touch. She could feel the vibrations from the auxiliary power unit, sensed the readiness of a machine eager to fly. What was wrong with her? Transmission issues, some hydraulic leaks, and the weather radar was giving us ghost returns, Mackenzie replied. We've fixed what we could, but she's not exactly what I'd call mission ready for what you're planning. Through the hangar's open doors, Nakamura could see the weather deteriorating rapidly. Clouds hung low and dark over the mountains, and the wind was picking up strength with each passing minute. In 90 minutes, maybe less, those peaks would be socked in completely, turning the rescue mission into a recovery operation. Wrench, I need you to understand something, she said quietly, her voice carrying easily over the noise of the hangar. Those men up there don't have the luxury of a fully mission-ready aircraft. They have what we can give them, and right now, that's this bird in me. Mackenzie studied her face, searching for the bravado and false confidence he had seen in so many pilots over the years. Instead, he found something that surprised him, a calm acceptance of risk that spoke of hard-earned experience. Yes, ma'am, she'll fly true for you. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Doc Martinez approached with her medic bag and survival gear, her expression grim but determined. At 28, she had already seen more combat than most soldiers saw in entire careers, but something about this mission felt different, heavier somehow, as if the weight of history was pressing down on them all. Ma'am, I've prepped for multiple casualties, Martinez said, patting her medical kit. But if we're flying into what Intel says we're flying into, I hope you've got more than just pilot skills to get us through this. Nakamura looked at her crew, really looked at them, seeing past the uniforms and rank insignia to the human beings who were about to trust her with their lives. These weren't the same faces that had died 3 years ago, but the weight of responsibility felt identical. The familiar knot of fear and determination twisted in her stomach. Doc Wrench, she said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her, I won't lie to you. Where we're going, people die. Good people, brave people, people with families waiting for them at home. But those SEALs up there are counting on us, and I'll be damned if I let them down. She paused, letting the words settle between them like a covenant. If either of you wants to step away, now's the time. No questions asked, no judgment passed. Neither moved. Outside, the first drops of rain began to spatter against the hangar doors, each drop a countdown toward the moment when rescue would become impossible. Somewhere in those mountains, Alpha Team was running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and time. The only thing standing between them and a body bag was a pilot nobody had heard of, flying a helicopter that wasn't quite ready, into weather that should have kept them all on the ground. Nakamura climbed into the pilot's seat and began her pre-flight checklist, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across switches and controls. But her mind was 3 years in the past, reliving the night that had changed everything, wondering if today would finally give her the chance to change it back. The rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, until the distinctive whop-whop-whop of the Black Hawk filled the hangar with purposeful thunder. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her window as the engine spooled up to flight idle, his face a mask of controlled tension. He handed her a sealed envelope through the small opening. Grid coordinates, frequencies, and authentication codes, he shouted over the rotor noise. Alpha Team's call sign is Raven 6. They know you're coming. Nakamura nodded and tucked the envelope into her flight suit pocket. Through her headset, she could hear the tower clearing her for immediate departure, their voices tight with the knowledge that they were sending 3 people into a meat grinder. Ghost, this is Bagram Tower. You are cleared for immediate departure, vectors to follow. Godspeed. As the Black Hawk lifted off into the darkening sky, Nakamura felt the familiar sensation of leaving the Earth behind, of entering that realm between heaven and hell where pilots lived and died by split-second decisions. Behind them, the lights of Bagram Air Base fell away like earthbound stars. Ahead lay the mountains, shrouded in clouds that promised violence and redemption in equal measure. The first 20 minutes of flight were deceptively peaceful. Nakamura followed the valleys eastward, keeping low to avoid the worst of the weather while maintaining enough altitude to clear the ridgelines. The MH-60M responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, banking and climbing with the fluid grace of a raptor riding thermals. Through her night vision goggles, the world appeared in shades of green and gray, transformed into an alien landscape where familiar landmarks became mysterious and threatening. Mackenzie monitored the engines and systems from the crew chief's position, calling out readings and warnings with the steady professionalism that marked veteran aircrew. Martinez sat quietly, checking and rechecking her medical supplies, her face a study in controlled anxiety. "Ghost, this is Raven 6, over." The voice crackled through Nakamura's headset with the urgency of men under fire. She recognized the tone, controlled desperation mixed with fatting hope. She had heard it before, 3 years ago, in her own voice as she called for help that never came. "Raven 6, this is Ghost, inbound to your position. What's your status, over?" "Ghost, we've got 4 wounded, including our HVT. Ammunition running low and we're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Weather's closing in fast, visibility dropping to near zero. Can you make it through?" Nakamura checked her instruments and looked ahead at the wall of clouds now completely obscuring the mountains. Lightning flickered within the storm cells, and she could feel the first effects of turbulence starting to buffet the aircraft. Any rational pilot would turn back now, would cite safety protocols and live to fly another day. But rationality was a luxury Alpha Team couldn't afford. "Raven 6, Ghost copies all, I'm coming through. What's your tactical situation?" "We're in a compound approximately 200 meters square, surrounded on 3 sides by hostiles. Only clear approach is from the north, but it's under intermittent fire. We can mark our position with strobes on your command." Nakamura studied her moving map display, correlating the coordinates Rodriguez had given her with the terrain features barely visible through the approaching storm. The landing zone was a nightmare, a small courtyard surrounded by multi-story buildings that would create devastating wind patterns and provide perfect cover for enemy fighters. "Copy, Raven 6. I'll be approaching from the north in approximately 15 minutes. Have your people ready for immediate extraction." "Roger, Ghost, and thanks for coming to get us." The simple words hit Nakamura harder than she expected. 3 years of guilt and self-doubt compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. This was why she flew, why she had endured the whispers and sideways glances, why she had studied and trained and pushed herself beyond every reasonable limit. This was her chance to finally bring her people home. As the Black Hawk entered the storm, the world outside became a chaos of wind, rain, and lightning. The helicopter bucked and twisted like a living thing fighting for its life, and Nakamura's hands moved constantly on the controls, making thousands of tiny corrections to keep them airborne and on course. Through it all, she flew with the calm precision of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. The storm hit them like a physical blow at 8,000 feet, transforming the Black Hawk from a precision instrument into a cork bobbing in an ocean of violence. Nakamura gripped the cyclic with both hands as turbulence threw them sideways into a downdraft that dropped them 300 feet in seconds. Her stomach lurched, but her hands remained steady, working the controls with the unconscious skill of a concert pianist playing a familiar sonata. Lightning strobed around them, turning the cockpit into a nightmare of shadows and brilliant white flashes. The smell of ozone and fear filled the cabin as St. Elmo's fire danced across the windscreen. Through her headset, she could hear Mackenzie calling out warnings about rotor RPM and engine temperatures, his voice tight but professional. "Ghost, Raven 6, be advised we're taking heavy fire. Our position is compromised. Say your ETA, over." Nakamura glanced at her GPS display, but the numbers meant nothing in conditions like these. Time and distance became fluid concepts when every second required fighting just to stay airborne. "Raven 6, Ghost is approximately 10 minutes out, but I'm going to need you to guide me in. Visibility is 0 and dropping." The radio crackled with gunfire and shouting in the background. "Roger, Ghost. We'll mark our position with IR strobes. You're going to be coming in hot enemy positions in buildings surrounding the LZ. We'll suppress what we can, but you're going to take fire." Martinez looked up from her position in the cabin, her face pale in the green glow of the cockpit lighting. "Ma'am, what if we can't make it through?" Nakamura didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the terrain gradually rising beneath them, the mountain peaks invisible but deadly in the storm. Her night vision goggles showed nothing but green static, and the aircraft's weather radar painted an abstract picture of violence in shades of red and yellow. "Doc," she finally said, her voice carrying easily over the rotor noise and storm, "3 years ago, I lost my entire crew on a mission just like this one. I made mistakes, hesitated when I should have acted, second-guessed myself when decisiveness was what my people needed. 6 Rangers died because I wasn't good enough." She paused, adjusting course slightly to follow a valley that appeared momentarily in the swirling chaos. "Today, I'm going to be good enough. We're going to get those SEALs out and we're all going home. That's not hope talking, that's mathematics. I've run every calculation, planned for every contingency, and visualized this approach 1,000 times in the past 3 years." Mackenzie's voice cut through the intercom. "Ma'am, we're approaching the coordinates. I've got intermittent ground returns on radar, but nothing clear enough for a precision approach." Nakamura felt the familiar cold calm settle over her as the moment of truth approached. This was the place where pilots lived or died, where split-second decisions echoed through eternity. She reduced airspeed and began a gradual descent, using every instrument available to build a mental picture of the terrain below. "Raven 6, Ghost is beginning approach. Light up those strobes now." "Ghost, strobes are active. You're coming in over heavy resistance. Recommend fast approach and immediate departure." Through the storm and darkness, Nakamura caught the first glimpse of infrared strobes flashing in the valley below. The landing zone was smaller than she had hoped, surrounded by buildings that would create treacherous wind patterns. But she had trained for this, had studied every possible approach until the knowledge became instinct. The Black Hawk descended through layers of wind shear that tried to flip them upside down. Nakamura compensated automatically, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals while her hands made constant adjustments to collective and cyclic. The aircraft shuddered and bucked, but held true to her commands. At 500 feet, muzzle flashes began to sparkle like deadly fireworks from windows and rooftops surrounding the compound. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of heavier weapons, and Mackenzie began calling out threats with the calm professionalism of a man who had seen this dance too many times before. "Taking fire from the east, ma'am. Multiple positions in that 3-story building." Nakamura banked left to avoid the heaviest concentration of fire, then rolled back right as tracers streaked past the cockpit. The world became a kaleidoscope of violence: muzzle flashes, tracer rounds, the strobing lights of the landing zone, and the constant lightning illuminating everything in stark, hellish detail. 100 feet, Mackenzie called out, "LZ in sight." Below them, Nakamura could see Alpha Team's positions marked by return fire and the disciplined muzzle flashes of American weapons. The SEALs were laying down covering fire with the precision of men who understood that their lives depended on accuracy and fire discipline. At 50 feet, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the tail boom, missing by inches and exploding against the mountainside in a shower of sparks and stone. Nakamura felt the concussion wave rock the aircraft but held her approach steady, committed now to the landing regardless of what hell waited below. The Black Hawk settled into the compound courtyard like a thunderstorm touching Earth. Alpha Team materialized from the shadows with the fluid efficiency of ghosts, carrying their wounded and dragging equipment through rotor wash that turned dust and debris into a stinging cloud. Nakamura held the aircraft steady, despite the crosswinds created by the surrounding buildings. Her entire world focused on the delicate balance between collective, cyclic, and rudder that kept them from cartwheeling into the stone walls. Through her peripheral vision, she saw Mackenzie and Martinez working frantically to load the wounded. The crew chief had rigged a hoist system to bring up the most seriously injured, while Doc Martinez triaged casualties with swift, professional movements. Each second on the ground increased their vulnerability exponentially, but rushing would mean leaving people behind. "Ghost, Raven 6, we've got a problem," the SEAL team leader's voice crackled through her headset. "Our HVT is critical, multiple gunshot wounds, internal bleeding. We need immediate dust-off to a trauma center, but he might not survive the flight." Nakamura's mind raced through the mathematics of fuel consumption, weather deterioration, and flight time to medical facilities. The nearest trauma center was back at Bagram, 40 minutes through deteriorating weather with a patient who might die en route. But the alternative, leaving him behind, wasn't an option. "Raven 6 will make it work. Get him loaded." Enemy fire intensified as the Taliban fighters realized their targets were escaping. Bullets sparked off the aircraft's armored hull while RPGs streaked overhead like deadly meteors. One round shattered the right door gunner's window, filling the cabin with wind and rain, but the structural integrity held. "Last man aboard," Mackenzie shouted over the intercom. "We are loaded and ready for immediate departure." Nakamura didn't hesitate. She pulled collective and cyclic simultaneously, lifting the overloaded Black Hawk straight up through the worst of the ground fire. The aircraft strained against the added weight and degraded performance caused by the high altitude and adverse weather, but responded with the grudging cooperation of a machine pushed beyond its limits, but not yet ready to quit. As they cleared the compound walls, tracer fire followed them like angry hornets, but the volume decreased as they climbed beyond effective range. Nakamura banked north toward Bagram, following the valleys that would provide the smoothest ride for her critically wounded passenger while keeping them below the worst of the storm. Behind them, the compound faded into the mountain darkness, another pinprick of violence in a war that had already lasted too long and cost too much. But tonight, 8 men who should have died would live to see another dawn. Sometimes, in a world full of impossible choices and tragic endings, that simple fact was enough to tip the scales toward meaning. The flight back to Bagram tested every skill Nakamura had accumulated over 4,000 hours of flight time. The wounded HVT, a Taliban commander whose intelligence value made him worth the impossible rescue, drifted in and out of consciousness, while Martinez worked frantically to keep him stable. Each downdraft and wind shear threatened to undo her medical efforts, but Doc's hands moved with the steady precision of someone who had learned to provide critical care in moving aircraft. Through her headset, Nakamura could hear the wounded man's labored breathing mixed with Martinez's quiet encouragements in Spanish, a language that transcended battlefield loyalties when life hung in the balance. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were risking American lives to save a man who had spent years trying to kill Americans, but that complexity belonged to politicians and philosophers. Her job was simply to fly. "Ghost, Bagram Tower, you are cleared for priority approach to the medical pad. Trauma team standing by." The lights of the air base appeared through the storm like a constellation of hope, each illuminated runway and building representing safety and medical care for the men bleeding in her cabin. Nakamura began her descent with the measured precision of someone who understood that the hardest part of any rescue mission was often the landing, when exhaustion and relief combined to create the conditions for fatal mistakes. Mackenzie called out altitudes and airspeeds with metronomic regularity, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos of wind and weather. The aircraft handled differently now, lighter by the weight of fuel consumed, but heavier with the burden of wounded men whose lives depended on her ability to set them down gently on the medical pad. At 100 feet, the runway lights became individual beacons instead of a distant glow. Medical personnel waited in the downwash of the landing zone, their equipment secured against rotor wash, their faces reflecting the controlled urgency of trauma professionals who understood that minutes saved lives. The Black Hawk touched down with barely a tremor, settling onto the medical pad like a bird returning to its nest. Before the rotors had stopped turning, medical teams swarmed the aircraft, transferring the wounded to stretchers and advanced life support systems with the choreographed efficiency of people who had perfected their craft through repetition and necessity. As the last patient disappeared into the medical facility, Nakamura finally allowed herself to shut down the engines. The sudden silence felt overwhelming after hours of rotor noise and engine vibration. Her hands shook slightly as she removed her helmet, not from fear, but from the physiological aftermath of sustained adrenaline and focus. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her window as she completed her post-flight checklist, his face showing the relief of a man who had watched impossible odds resolve into successful outcomes. "Ghost, I don't know how the hell you pulled that off, but Alpha Team says to tell you that you've got a beer waiting for you anytime you want it." Nakamura managed a tired smile. "Just tell them to stay out of trouble for a while. I'm getting too old for this kind of flying." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. This was what she had been born to do, to venture into places where others couldn't go, to bring people home against impossible odds, to transform mechanical skills into something approaching grace under pressure. The guilt and self-doubt that had followed her for 3 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been tempered by the knowledge that, when it mattered most, she had been good enough. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that promised better weather and new possibilities. Somewhere in the medical facility, 8 men were alive who shouldn't have been, and that simple fact would ripple outward through families and communities in ways she might never know but could finally appreciate. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Nakamura sat in the same briefing room where Captain Rodriguez had asked his desperate question. But this time, she wasn't hiding in the shadows. This time, she occupied a seat at the front of the room, facing an audience of pilots, crew chiefs, and flight surgeons who had come to hear her present the lessons learned from what the aviation community was already calling the miracle at Grid 41S. The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed meteorological data, approach angles, and performance calculations, but the real story was written in the faces of her audience. These were professionals who understood that the difference between heroism and tragedy often came down to preparation, skill, and the willingness to act when action seemed impossible. The key to successful operations in degraded visual environments, Nakamura explained, advancing to a slide showing instrument approach procedures, isn't superhuman pilot skill or lucky guesses. It's systematic preparation, crew resource management, and the discipline to trust your instruments even when every instinct tells you to do otherwise. A young pilot raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you overcome the fear factor when you're flying into conditions that should keep you on the ground?" Nakamura paused, considering the question that cut to the heart of military aviation. Around the room, veteran aircrew leaned forward slightly, recognizing the universal challenge that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. "Fear is a tool," she said finally. "It keeps you alert, makes you check and double-check your decisions, prevents the kind of overconfidence that kills crews. The trick isn't eliminating fear, it's learning to make decisions despite being afraid." She clicked to the next slide, showing the compound where Alpha Team had been trapped. 3 years ago, I let fear paralyze me at a critical moment. Good people died because I hesitated when I should have acted. That failure taught me that the only thing worse than being afraid is letting fear prevent you from doing what needs to be done. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the audience. In the back, she noticed Captain Rodriguez watching with the expression of a man who had learned to recognize the difference between bravado and genuine competence. After the briefing, as pilots and crew members filed out discussing approach techniques and weather minimums, Mackenzie approached with his characteristic blend of respect and familiarity. The crew chief had been assigned to her permanently after their successful mission, a recognition of the bond formed in combat that transcended normal military relationships. "Ma'am, I've got some news you might find interesting," he said, holding up a maintenance report. "Remember those transmission problems we had on that night flight? Turns out they were worse than we thought. Engineering says we should have experienced total hydraulic failure within 30 minutes of takeoff." Nakamura studied the technical data, understanding immediately what Mackenzie was telling her. They had completed a 4-hour mission in an aircraft that should have crashed before they reached the mountains. The margin between success and catastrophe had been even thinner than she had realized. "So we were flying a helicopter held together by prayer and determination," she said, managing a wry smile. "Yes, ma'am, but I figure that's pretty much standard operating procedure for special operations aviation." Outside the briefing room, word of Ghost's mission had spread through the aviation community like ripples across still water. She was no longer the pilot nobody had heard of, no longer the officer who had failed to save her crew. She had become something more valuable and more dangerous. She had become a legend. But legends, Nakamura understood, were just stories people told to make sense of random events and human choices. The truth was simpler and more complex. She had trained for years to be ready for one impossible night, and when that night came, she had been good enough. Sometimes, in a world full of variables and unknowns, being good enough was indistinguishable from being perfect. The recognition that followed the mission came in forms both official and personal. A Bronze Star with Vitavice for valor, a promotion recommendation that would take her to the rank of commander, an assignment as the new head of extreme weather flight training for Special Operations Aviation. But the recognition that mattered most came from Alpha Team themselves, who had adopted her as an honorary member of their unit and insisted she join them for their post-deployment celebration. The party at the NCO Club was everything Nakamura had expected: loud, boisterous, and filled with the kind of military humor that outsiders found incomprehensible. But as she sat surrounded by men who had trusted her with their lives, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she belonged. Staff Sergeant Martinez, now fully recovered from the mission's minor injuries, raised her beer in a toast. To Ghost, who proved that when the weather gets too bad for angels, you call in the Navy. The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, free of the undertone of doubt that had followed Nakamura for so long. These people had seen her work under pressure, had witnessed her transform impossible conditions into successful outcomes, and their acceptance was based on demonstrated competence rather than politics or perception. Captain Rodriguez approached as the evening wound down, his expression serious despite the celebration around them. "Ghost, I wanted you to know, the HVT we extracted provided intelligence that led to the disruption of 3 major Taliban operations. The mission you flew saved a lot of lives beyond just Alpha Team." Nakamura nodded, understanding the broader implications of that night's work. Military operations rarely existed in isolation. Each successful mission created opportunities for other successes, while failures cascaded through the system in unpredictable ways. The weight of responsibility that came with special operations was measured not just in immediate outcomes, but in consequences that might not become apparent for months or years. "Sir, I've been thinking about that night," she said, setting down her untouched beer. "About why you asked for a combat pilot specifically, when there were plenty of other qualified aviators in that room." Rodriguez smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Because combat pilots understand something that peacetime aviators don't, that sometimes the mission requirements exceed the aircraft limitations, and you have to find a way to make it work anyway. You can't teach that kind of thinking in flight school. As the celebration continued around them, Nakamura felt the final pieces of her professional identity settling into place. She was no longer defined by her failures or haunted by the ghosts of missions gone wrong. She had become something more valuable, a pilot who could be trusted with impossible missions and tasked with training others to exceed their own limitations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young lieutenant who approached with the nervous energy of someone delivering important news. "Ma'am, I have orders for you from Special Operations Command." Nakamura accepted the sealed envelope, nodding the priority classification and the secure handling requirements. Around her, the party continued, but she felt the familiar weight of new responsibilities settling across her shoulders. Inside the envelope, she found orders for assignment to a classified program developing new techniques for extreme weather operations in denied territory. The mission parameters were vague, but she recognized the language of black operations and special access programs. Somewhere in the Pentagon, planners were already working on the next impossible mission, and they wanted her to help make it possible. As she read through the technical requirements and training schedules, Nakamura realized that her night flight into the Hindu Kush had been more than just a successful rescue. It had been a job interview for responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. The military had a way of testing its people,